Have you ever wondered, how do I plot my book? Well, you are in the right place, because today on Write, Publish, Repeat, Season 1, Episode 2, we are joined by Bonnie Johnston, who is going to talk plotting your book. So this is a good one. Get your pen, get your paper, take notes.
Write, publish, repeat, it echoes through the air. A chorus for creators, a call to those who dare. With cookies as his compass and a pen that won't retreat, he journeys through the pages. Write, publish, repeat.
Hello and welcome to Write, Publish, Repeat. It is Season 1, Episode 2 of our newly focused show. Today's topic is, how do I plot my book? With Sean Platt and our special guest, Bonnie Johnston. Sean, go ahead and do the intro for Bonnie.
Okay, well, I'm going to add a T to her last name first. It's okay. Johnston, Bonnie Johnston.
I wrote it quickly.
But that's okay. I'm imagining, Bonnie and I have never talked about this before, but I'm imagining she's had to add that T for much of her existence with the T, right, Bonnie? Is this true? Is this?
Well, to be fair, like in Slack, her name isn't. It's just Bonnie, and I've always just thought of her as Bonnie. So I've never thought.
That's true.
And I didn't know how to introduce her on the episode, like if she was using her full name or anything, because I don't know what y'all with your pen names and your fancy stuff. Look, you're already derailing me. It's over. It's done.
That's fair. So. Just real quick, I'm curious. So if this is episode 1 or 2 of season 1, mm-hmm. what was all the things we do? Is that episode 0, episode garbage? Like, what do we refer to that to?
Isn't everything garbage in the end? The sun's just going to engulf us anyway. So.
Well, that is true, and a rather sunny way to look at this Friday afternoon. So here's so this is episode 2. Dave did an amazing job shepherding us through episode 1.
It's all downhill from there.
Yeah, I feel like we may have peaked. I'm not sure, but you'll notice, for those of you who are author velocitors, author velociraptors, we'll workshop the name. You may notice that I'm in my author velocity spot. I'm sitting down. That's because this conversation will mostly be between Dave and Bonnie. I'm sure I will chime in, probably too much, but I just want to introduce Bonnie real quick in this way. So we've done a couple of the workshops in the last couple of weeks, and this is how I've introduced Bonnie, because I just love this story so much, because it says a lot. So a few years ago, we were doing this clocking out thing. We're leaving. Blah, 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 we're going to leave education and we won't be back. And then here we are 7 years later or whatever. But Bonnie was in a wave of, bought a bunch of stuff at the time. She bought our no ROI event, which was just us watching movies and smoking weed in Denver, which was great. She did a closed door mastermind. And in that closed door mastermind, she came with some help. She wanted help. And she said, I'm a really great teacher, and I'm sought after, but I want to scale my education business. And I said, no, you don't. You want to join Sterling and Stone. And she's been with us ever since.
Sean's been talking people out of their dreams for all.
I do. Yes, I have been. I took her dream and I made it my dream, and denied the entire writing community of her brilliance. I did promise her that we would write something called Core Curriculum, which we did, and all 9 books in the Writer's Toolkit, or whatever we're going to call it in the future, are written, and they're done. They're in a pile over there. But I'm sure that will see the light of the day sooner rather than later now. Anyway, the second part of that story is that shortly after that, someone named Neve went to Bonnie and said, hey, I would really like some help with this series that I'm working on. And Bonnie said, well, I only work with Sterling and Stone. And so Neve cozied up to the company. And many years later, Neve is now the CEO of Sterling and Stone. So
wow, you all are such master manipulators. So, I feel like I'm on an episode of Succession.
Yeah, it's a little Game of Thrones here, but it is awesome, because both of those people have made my life so much immeasurably better. and my work is better, and our work as a company is better, and all of these new things that we're doing with Story Merchants, including this podcast, would not be possible without Bonnie. She is instrumental behind the scenes in most things that I do these days. So very welcome to Bonnie. And you guys, she's also a serious introvert, so the fact that she's like giving y'all FaceTime, you don't even know how valuable that is.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so we're starting this, like, the first episode was for people that were brand new to writing, and this is kind of, people that are new to writing, how do they tell their story? And today I wanted to talk about plotting the book, and you are a master at plotting. Ever since you come into the company, your expertise, like, I didn't even like plotting before you, honestly. I'd rather I plot something like half-ass, and
it was so begrudging.
Yeah, and then I'd pants my way through it. But then you came along and you saw issues all in stories we already were close to done with, but also outlines that we were working on, and made me immeasurably better. So thank you for that.
Aw, that's so sweet, Dave. Thank you.
And now
they've been handing out the compliments like candy lately, Bonnie.
Yeah, I'm sick of myself, really. I think I'm going to have to go punch a puppy after this is over.
Wow.
Oh, no.
It doesn't take him long, though, right? He just falls right back into it.
I lull you in a false sense of, Dave's nice. Okay, so how do we get started with plotting a story? Well, first of all, there's the terms 3-act structure and 4-act structure. If you could briefly explain, that and which is better, and then how to begin.
Okay. 3-act structure and 4-act structure are pretty much the same thing. We basically, because Act 2 and 3-act structure is so long, we split at the midpoint and consider the 2 halves of Act 2 in a 3-act structure to just be their own acts, because they do need to have their own build and their own climax anyway, right? So you might as well think of it that way as you're constructing it, so that you're already in that mindset of like having the climax for each of the 4 acts and making sure that your story is going to have the peaks and troughs that it needs to have. But most story structure is really just a crystallization of good storytelling decisions. Like in a good story, you have ups and downs, you have things that draw people in, you have things that get them all ramped up, you have quiet moments that kind of let them breathe and let them kind of absorb what just happened and have the emotional reaction. And all the different story structures pretty much do the same thing in terms of creating those ups and downs and putting the quiet moments at the right point so that you actually get good pacing. Okay, did that answer your question?
Yes.
I think I lost myself.
I'll start with the beginning. Usually the common advice is to begin with the inciting incident. Can you explain what that is, and how do people discover what that is?
Oh, yeah. The inciting incident is just the thing that kicks the protagonist out of their ordinary world. It's like a change that comes into their life that throws things out of whack a little bit. And it could be something good or it could be something bad. But basically it changes things in a way that they don't even realize at the time is permanent and irreversible. So usually you have the opening of your story. You could start with the inciting incident. Sometimes you do, but usually you have at least a little bit that shows what your character's life is normally like and what kind of conflicts they're normally engaged in and what their standing problem is, the thing that like they're just living with that is usually tied to their character arc and is making them a little unhappy, but they figured out how to cope with it. And then the inciting incident is something that just messes things up so they no longer have a handle on whatever that problem is, and it usually introduces new conflicts related to the antagonist so that they're now faced with a problem that they can't just make go away by doing things the way they normally do.
Now, is there a name for this beginning part that I incorrectly called the inciting incident?
You mean the part before the inciting incident? I just call it the everyday world because that's what it's called in the hero's journey, and that's so self-explanatory that I feel. I mean, I'm sure there's other names for it in other structures. Okay,
so how, you said you're antagonist. How do you determine what makes a good antagonist, and how do they oppose the hero of the story?
Two things that are true of a really good antagonist is one, they represent what's broken in the protagonist's world. They're kind of like an embodiment of what's already wrong with the world that the protagonist is putting up with. And also you want to design your own antagonist so that they're perfect for just getting under your protagonist's skin. Usually having them be not necessarily opposites in some way, but like some way in which their goals are mutually exclusive, but also who they are is both antagonistic, but also a little bit complementary.
So if like the protagonist is an early riser who gets all kinds of shit done, his antagonist might be somebody who is always late on deadlines and has a night schedule.
Dave.
Yes, absolutely. But also another great antagonist for that person is someone who gets up even earlier and gets everything done a day early and is just totally out competing the protagonist. So you can go either way.
I actually like your antagonist way better. Dave, you're not even a good antagonist.
Yeah, that's what my wife says every day. So when you're developing the antagonist, how much do you like to focus on their part of the story, their life, their inner life, and do you also give them a sort of hero's journey as well?
You can. It kind of depends on the story. If the antagonist is getting redeemed, or if it's the kind of story where they start out as antagonists and by the climax they're working together as partners, you might put a little bit more into the antagonist. Or if you have an antagonist where their descent is actually reinforcing the theme of the story, you might want to put some more thought into how that's going to play out in terms of who the who the antagonist is and what their journey is going to be. So I actually like to spend a lot of time on the antagonist personally, because that's where all the conflict in the story comes from. And like, it's really easy to go like, oh, here's my protagonist. They're so amazing and cool and they have all these abilities and they're going to do these cool things, right? But like, then you're like in the middle of the story, if you don't have a really strong antagonist who's working behind the scenes to make a lot of problems happen, it's like you run out of conflict, and then it's like, well, my protagonist did these cool things, so maybe I need to do a chase scene because I don't know what else happens here. So I actually usually start with I figure out kind of who the protagonist is, and then I like to design an antagonist that's going to be perfect for messing with them, and then I go back to the protagonist and develop them some more.
Okay. And so what is your next step? If you're starting an outline, you think of your protagonist, your antagonist, how many other characters do you consider in the beginning, and then where do you start after that?
I don't actually immediately build a cast, and I know some people do that. For me, the way my brain works, it's like I kind of want to understand what kind of story I'm telling, and I also want to understand like what the point of it is. Like, for example, does my theme need like a contagonist or a friend or ally of the protagonist who basically is someone who is constantly reflecting who the protagonist should be, or who's calling the protagonist on their bullshit? Or do I have the kind of story where maybe like we have an ensemble cast, even though the protagonist is the main character, we have 4 or 5 people around them who are all influencing the protagonist and trying to drive him in different directions, so that he has like multiple options in terms of where his character arc is going to go. So it kind of really depends on the kind of story you're trying to tell. I actually, once I have protagonist and antagonist, and actually, let me back up a little bit, because here's the process that we use a lot that actually helps resolve some of these questions. We've been snowflaking throughout our process, so that the very first thing we do is we make sure we have a complete premise. So that means protagonist, antagonist, external conflict, internal conflict, some idea of the theme that might change as the story gets developed, but kind of an idea of like, what's the story about, or what are we trying to say with it, and an idea of like what the midpoint change is going to be and what the climax is going to look like. And that kind of gives you your story in miniature, so you can be like, well, I know I want my character to understand this by the end of the story, and I know I want it to have a tragic ending, or I know I want these 2 people to figure out how to work together, or whatever kind of story you're trying to tell. And then it's like, who do I need once you have that premise? protagonist and you know it's solid and the conflicts are going to be strong enough, then you can ask yourself, okay, who do I need to tell this story? Do I need a best friend who's going to stab the protagonist in the back because I need to have the protagonist get betrayed by everyone around them for the story to work? Or do I need someone that they're going to be super competitive with? Do I need them to be really isolated? Maybe I don't want them to have anyone around them other than the antagonist that they actually have to rely on for everything. So kind of doing it fractally, having that premise so that you have all your conflicts lined up first. And then we tend to develop into a story document. And that's where I start bringing in, it's basically like a brief where you have like all your characters that you're going to bring in, world building elements, plot ideas. Like nothing is solid at that point, but it's still like, here's all the things that could happen in the story. Here's what I think the midpoint is going to be. Here's why I think the story ends. And that's a really good piece of advice. Not everybody writes that way, but if you are the kind of person who usually knows how your story ends, nailing that down in more detail right away can really give you, it's like a compass that you can use to drive through the story because you know what you're heading toward. And then once I've got those story elements, I'll start playing with the characters and figuring out, well, I know these things could happen, like which of these characters are going to be involved and how can they drive the story forward and who looks like they're actually going to help me mess with a character to drive their character arc forward, or who actually is going to be a really good example to parallel the protagonist, to be like a negative example to support the theme. So basically making those kind of strategic decisions that are guided by who is the character that is the most important, which is the protagonist and antagonist, and what do I actually want to say about them, and using that to kind of make a lot of the other storytelling decisions.
And in the beginning, do you decide in this early stage before the outline, do you decide how many POVs it's going to be, what tense it's going to be, like first person, present, or how do you go about that? Or is it genre dependent?
Yes and yes. It is kind of genre dependent sometimes. Like, for example, we were working on domestic thrillers. And we were working on the kind of domestic thrillers where the protagonist is hiding a lot of secrets. And you kind of have to have that in first person so you have an unreliable narrator, because otherwise, if you think you're getting the character's unfiltered thoughts through deep third point of view, and then it turns out the character was lying to you the whole time, it feels like a cheat. Whereas if the character's talking to you, like you know that they could be withholding information. So sometimes the genre actually does tell you this has to be in first person point of view just because of the tricks I need to pull this story off. I have actually written stories where I've written the intro both in first and third limited just to see which one kind of felt better. I have a personal preference for writing in limited third, but like, for example, urban fantasy, you kind of have to write that in first person also. People expect that. So it's kind of like genre first and story first, and then personal preference for me. I know there are people who just like one of the point of views actually just is like how they think and how they write, and there's nothing wrong with that. Chances are you probably are attracted to genres where that works if that's what feels most comfortable to you.
Now, if you're going to write, let's say you're going to write urban fantasy, but you want to tell the story through more than one POV, would you go first person and just different POVs, which I think would be a lot harder to get the voice for each character right? Or would you balance first and third person? Like, what would be the, quote, correct way to do that?
I think first I'd ask myself, why do I want to tell this story in multiple point of views? Because usually one of the things with urban fantasy is you're seeing the world through somebody who has a special perspective and has special abilities, and you're exploring what the world is. What's it like to be like a vampire hunter or an elf or whatever in a non-magical world, right? Where magic is hidden or maybe only a few people have it. So I'd ask myself, first of all, why do I want multiple POVs? And then I would say, okay, given that I want multiple POVs, like, is it because I want the victim's perspective? Like, then maybe I'll do that I could do it in third if I want some distance, or I do it in first if I want to be really personal. And if I'm redeeming the villain, probably I want to do it in first because I really want to get into their heads. If I was doing it where I actually wanted to have a series with multiple characters, and maybe there isn't one genuine protagonists, there's 2 or 3 where we're really going to have them each have their own adventures through the series, then I think I might do it in limited third, because I'm already breaking genre conventions in terms of the kind of story that's being told. So then it's like, now I have to be like, if I'm going to break those conventions anyway, like what's the best possible way I can do it so that I'm telling the best possible story so people will accept the weird story that I'm trying to tell.
Bonnie's also super good at that. Well, why are you doing that? Right? Because as writers, as creators, I mean, I'm so guilty of that. Wouldn't it be cool if, you know, and I'm just excited about the idea, oh, we could do it third person and first person. But then Bonnie's going to be the first person to say, okay, I appreciate the idea.
Oh, you get a star.
Right, yeah. Like, Bonnie's super good about giving me my gold stars. Like, she'll always give me my gold star, but then she's like, wait, but is that about you and your little fancy idea, or is it about the reader? Because this really needs to be about the reader. And
I mean, you could do it that way, but a good writer would do.
Yes. But Bonnie is a chef when it comes to the compliment sandwich. Like, she's a gourmet. But it's true. It's like Bonnie's always going to bring it back down to what the reader deserves to have. And you need that. Like a good storyteller needs somebody who is making it about the story and about the reception of the story. And you could make an argument that, like, oh yeah, that's a really interesting way to tell a story if you mix tenses. Well, it is interesting, but so are crickets when you eat those, right? Like, but do you want to eat crickets? It's what is best for this actual experience, and multiple POVs could really add to it, especially if it's something really unreliable or whatever. But what Bonnie's going to point out is that it's friction. It's okay, well, you're asking the reader to do a little bit more work right now, and that's fine. We can ask the reader to do a little more work. What's the reward for them? And if the reward isn't bigger than the ask that you're introducing into the experience, then move on to another idea.
Okay, so you briefly mentioned snowflake method. Could you explain some of the plotting methods and the advantages of one over another, if there are specific?
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a great question. I don't think anybody's asked me that for quite a while. Okay, so the snowflake method, the benefit of that, the snowflake method is basically where you start. You could even just be with a sentence. And there's a guy named Randy Ingermanson who has a fantastic post that walks you through how to use the snowflake method to plot a story. So you can Google that. But it's
Wait, is that like really old? I feel like I read that like 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's been around for a couple decades.
I've read that before. It's really good.
Yeah, it actually kind of got me started. It was
me
like
too.
One of the first
Yeah.
And then I went right to Dwight Swain, which was like
me too. Okay, so do you want to actually? I think the Dwight Swain thing is worth it, and you'll articulate why it's so great, so much better than me. A copywriter gave me that book. And it's like, oh, you like fiction, you'll love this because it is treating fiction a little bit like copy in the best possible way. And it's such a nerdy, weird, off the beaten path book that I think you might have been the first person that I ever met who had also read it. And I mentioned it in passing one day, and it was like somebody plugged you into the wall. So can you explain to listeners what is special about this book?
So many things are special about this book. Dwight Swain was a very structured thinker, and he was someone who was really looking at fiction, not just in terms of like the traditional story structure, but he looked at it he wouldn't have used the word, I don't think, but he looked at it like an algorithm. He was basically like, how are we actually building? You
know how I know he wouldn't have used that word? Because he suggests that you use an electric typewriter instead of a manual one.
Right. So he basically breaks the way you tell a story down. The scene and sequel, which has been updated, stimulus response, he calls the motivation and reaction units, which has been updated. And actually, we update them a lot in the plotting book in the Storyteller's Toolbox. But basically, he's telling you, here's the big picture algorithm, here's the the microstructure of a scene algorithm. And he's really focused on the things that have emotional impact in the story, as opposed to trying to teach you everything about the story. Like, that book does not cover so many aspects of craft that you also need to learn, but he teaches you like what are the fundamentals of a really good story that you can start building everything else around. Like, his characterization, I think, is a little bit weak, and he doesn't really talk about character arc in as solid a way as I would like him to. He's really more focused on like, how do you tell a good, solid external story?
And he keeps you going too. Like, once I read that book, I barely.
Did you say the title of the book?
It's called, I think, Techniques of the Selling Writer. Is that
Yeah.
right, Bonnie? Yeah,
That's it,
and once I had his little formula down, I never got lost on the page. The idea of what should I write next was permanently taken care of. If I wasn't writing, it's because my resistance was so high, or I wanted to go fuck off, or whatever. It wasn't because I didn't have the basic tool set that I needed to do my job.
Yeah, it's a really good book, but it's hard to get through because it was like in the 50s that he was writing it, and it's very pedantic, and he's very structural oriented. It's very dry, so it will
reads like a textbook. It does read like a textbook, and you guys, I think that alone should tell you how awesome I think this book is, because I dropped out of high school. I hate textbooks, and this book slaps.
Okay, so we were talking about the different methods of plotting. Is that part of the snowflake method, or is that his own thing?
No, sorry, that's a total digression.
I blame Sean for that. Go on.
Okay. Okay, so snowflake method is basically, you could start with like a single sentence to describe your story idea, and then you put it into a paragraph and develop it a little bit more, and then you turn that into 3 paragraphs, beginning, middle, and end, and then it's just basically you're progressively like trying to come up with like the big picture, and then put more detail, and then more detail, and then eventually you have a synopsis, eventually you have an outline, eventually you actually turn that into the draft. So it's basically a way of starting with just like, I have an idea, and gradually in layers figuring out how that idea develops into a story. That's a great way to plot a story, especially if you're a beginner, because it kind of lets you just keep thinking through each step until you're ready to go to the next step. So if you're just starting out, I highly recommend that, and definitely go check out the article. One of the ways that I like to plot, you could plot with okay, let's go to templates next. You can go to an established story structure and say, here's the story structure, here's what's supposed to happen in each of these phases of my story, here's my tentpole scenes. And then I'm just going to go down the list and say, what is my character's everyday world? What is a great opening scene? What is the inciting incident? What happens after the inciting incident that leads up to the first plot point? And what happens at the first plot point? You can go through like that. That's a typical way that people do approach plot structure for the first time, and it usually makes you hate plot structure because it doesn't really connect what's going on with the characters to what's happening in the story. It's very much like, and then what happened, and then what happened, and then what happened, right? An alternative to that is, if you are trying plot structures for the first time, I would actually combine that with the method that Matt Stone and Trey Parker and Matt Stone.
Yeah, Trey Parker and Matt Stone. You got it. Yeah.
Yeah. They have a video out that you can go look for on YouTube that talks about how they plot, where they're saying, but then, or
meanwhile,
and then, but then, and meanwhile, and so, and they're basically using different types of causative links. They take you through a cycle of different types of causative links. So you could do one of those cycles for each phase of your story, and that gets you to connect, it'll get you to connect the plot points, like what's supposed to happen, with what's actually happening with your characters. Like, why do they do that? This happens, so the characters have to do this because they want that. And then, so then this will happen over here, but then things go wrong, right? And it takes you through this cycle of things that your characters are actually doing that make things happen in a way where they then have more conflict to deal with, instead of just going, and then what happens, and then what happens, where you, the author, are externally imposing random conflicts on the characters and then wondering why it doesn't feel like a story. And plot structures are great. I love them. I use multiple plot structures all the time. I love to make my own personal templates. Like, a lot of times I'll make a template that is custom to the story I'm trying to tell, that starts with a plot template. But I also don't use plot templates necessarily in order, or if I'm using a specific story structure, like I said at the beginning when we were talking about getting the premise down, I figure out what the midpoint is before I even have developed the protagonist much. I figure out what the climax should be. Those are like two of your big turning points of the story, right? It tells you how your character is going to have to change. It tells you how the second half of your story is going to be really different than the first half of your story if you figure out your midpoint, right? So going to the plot points that personally resonate for you. I have a friend who's like inciting incident and climax. Those are like the two things she kind of drives by. And everybody's different. So how you drive your character through the story, knowing what they want and what their pain is and what they're trying to accomplish and what they need that they're not willing to admit to themselves. Those are all things that you can use as compasses to kind of drive yourself through the story. Like, what would my character do next? But also knowing what the map is, what you're driving toward. If you know you're driving towards a happy ending, if you know you're driving towards like a point in the middle where the character suddenly realizes that they can't do anything the way they've been doing it before, that their life is a mess and they have to change. Some people drive by the dark moment. If you like know what your character's lowest point is and like everything you're doing is riding towards that lowest point to get them there, so that you know that that's going to set up the climax right. So I don't, when I use a plot structure, I don't plot linearly. I pick the point, and sometimes I already know the point. Even if I know the midpoint, sometimes I know the dark moment is really the thing that's like, this is what is going to make this story. If I can like just keep this part of the story in mind, everything else, all the other decisions I make are going to make sense.
So it's all about the suffering.
It's all about the suffering, Dave. There's no easy answer. I'm so sorry.
Do you think that the
Actually, there is an easy answer. Get somebody who understands plot structure to talk you through it. That's the easy answer.
I do think that templates are like recipes. It's like cooking, right? So for me, I've used templates too, a bunch of times. In fact, one of my favorites, Bonnie and I made together, the 40-sentence outline, which basically gave the finger to the 3-act structure and acknowledged that it was 4 acts, right? And so I do love templates, but I find templates to be like, now I'm not a cook. Fortunately, I'm married to an amazing cook, and the way she treats cooking is she'll use a recipe. It may teach her to cook something, but then it just becomes a reference point. And you don't want to have to look at the recipe every single time, because like it's different with baking. Baking's science, right? But if you're cooking something, it's really more about the cooking and the energy of the ingredients and what you're doing at any given time with fire, salt, heat, whatever, right? And if you know how to cook and you know what a certain recipe requires to make it delicious, then it's your experience that actually is helping to cook the meal. And I feel like when writers rely too much on the templates, they're basically they're becoming slaves to the recipe instead of interpreting the recipe to make the best possible dish.
Yeah, and I think if you understand, again, going back to the idea that all these different story structures are crystallizations of good storytelling decisions, right? It's like if you look at 4-act structure, or you can map the hero's journey and the virgin's promise and all these other structures to that. But basically, 4-act structures, a character starts out, they're doing okay. They sort of have control of what's going on in their lives. The inciting incident, the antagonist comes in, the antagonist messes everything up. And then they go into the extraordinary world and they start trying to get their life back, but they're having to operate in this new way. Basically, they're starting to get control of their environment again. They're starting to figure things out. The first pain point, the antagonist comes in and messes everything up again. And then the next eighth of the story is the character just trying to figure out how do I come back from what the antagonist has done to me? And you could literally go through the story and just alternate. Okay, get my protagonist in a good situation, have the antagonist come mess it up. Make sure that like roughly every eighth of the story, there's a big change in the power struggle so that the protagonist has that up and down journey. And like the reason you do it like in eighths, so that there's like a high point and a low point in every act, is basically that's roughly the rhythm that you have seen stories told in, and that all your readers have seen stories told in, because we get bored if things don't change. And basically the rhythm of storytelling is like set something up, introduce a change, have this change, the aftermath of this change has to get resolved. And as soon as it gets resolved, the reader gets bored again. So you have to introduce a new change, right? And you can look at all the story structures and just say, like, who's in control here? Who's having problems here? Where's the change getting introduced, and like how is the aftermath of that getting resolved? It's just like, are things fixed? Because you need to introduce a new problem if things are fixed. And ideally you're introducing conflicts that are overlapping, so your protagonist never has solved all their problems at any given moment until the end of the story. So if you're a pantser or you're allergic to structure and you just don't want to think about plotting in that way, write the story, but always be thinking about, like, is there enough conflict here? Is there a point where the reader is going to get bored because my protagonist has fixed things? Is my antagonist doing enough to mess things up or to create more interesting problems in the world that actually make what my protagonist is doing right now harder or more interesting or more compelling? It's all really about change and conflict and how we deal with change and conflict as human beings. So like, you have an instinctive recognition of what drama is and what creates drama, right? And you have an instinctive understanding of when you're bored. If you're bored, the reader's bored. And if you're really engaged in, like, oh my God, what is my character going to do next? The reader will be too. So, like, you intuitively have an understanding of how storytelling works, that can just be refined over time. And then paying attention to all the books that you read and the stories you consume on TV, and like, just notice this, like, when do things get good for the character? Like, how hard do things get at different times in the movie? Like, at what point do we have the low points? And at what point do you start to get bored if you're watching a movie that is not good? Right? And just start paying attention to that in terms of, like, one of my favorite games to play is after I watch a movie I didn't like with my husband, is we go for a walk and we play the game, how would we fix this movie? Like, where did we get bored? What did we hate? Like, what would have been way cooler? You know, why did the characters not make sense? How would we have made them make sense? So just play that game.
We have a bonus episode someday of how you would fix Goonies.
Oh my God, it has to be 3 hours.
And then you and Dave can just shit on Goonies.
The only way to fix it is to go back in time and kill each of their parents before they can get together to make this movie.
This is the only.
There is no other way.
I think this is.
I've looked at all of the timelines and all of the possibilities, and it always ends the same.
I think this is the thing that Bonnie and Dave have in common more than anything else, is their hatred of Goonies. And it was so funny because I was so excited for Bonnie finally seeing Goonies, and it did not go well for my childhood.
I'm so sorry, Sean, but you're right, Dave. It's a terrible movie.
It is. So I will just say, for Sean, his brain hadn't fully formed when he watched it, so that's the only thing that makes any sense. So,
I'm just younger enough than both of you to fully appreciate, but your childhoods were already dead. That's what happened. When you guys saw it, your childhoods were dead. Mine was in full bloom.
Mine was dead rather early, so yes.
That is true.
So when you talk about all the different plot changes and up and down momentum, does that vary wildly with different genres? Like, I imagine, like, I don't read romance, but I imagine, like, certain types of romances, there might be way more pendulum swings. How do you determine, is it just getting familiar with the genre you're going to write, or is there, like, a specific definitive thing that you should do in one genre but not another when it comes to just the overall arc?
I would just read your genre and your subgenre specifically. And there's like romance structures that specifically have the right rhythm in there. And I can't remember the name of the book. It's not Take Your Pants Off. Romancing the Beat?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It is Romancing the Beats. Yeah.
Yes. So, like, that's a fantastic book that has a romance structure in it. And Break Into Fiction is another one that is very suitable for romance. It's got the 2 point of views, and that's like a really fun book to work through because it's like it's very template oriented, but it's all organized in terms of question prompts so that you can basically answer questions through your story to kind of try and figure out how to write it. And it's not romance specific, but it does have 2 points of view, so it's very adaptable to romance.
Is that James Scott Bell?
No, it's, man, like, if I had known I would have gotten out my stack of plotting books if I'd known that's what we were talking about.
I'll put it in the show notes.
We can put it all in the show notes. Like, I'll make a list of all the books we talked about with the author names. But yeah, it's just like really read in your genre and just pay attention and like notice like where did like pick your favorite book. I love picking a model book for a project, something that is like that has roughly the kind of structure and tells sort of the kind of story that I'm doing that I think is a really good example of that story type. Go through and read it and say like, on page 50 this happens, on page 75 this happens, on page 200, like find the midpoint. Was the midpoint late in this one? Because sometimes you can move the midpoint a little bit and it actually makes it a better story, right? Or move the dark moment. Where did they put the dark moment? Because that could be anywhere between somewhere in act 3 up until like right before they solve things in the climax. And go through and just look at the pacing there and say which of these chapters feels really fast to me? Where are all the like quiet scenes and the breathers, and make a map for yourself, and then go like, okay, now I'm going to see if I can tell my story the way I want to tell it. But then as you're plotting it, look at it and go like, oh, I've had like 8 really fast paced hectic scenes, and this author put a quiet breathing room scene like in chapter 4. Like, have I got too much action? Is this too fast paced? Do I need to kind of slow the story down somewhere like between chapters 3 and 5? And maybe your story is actually different enough. But looking at how other people do things, it's like that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Other people have figured out what good pacing is already. And if you have a favorite book that is roughly similar to the kind of story you're trying to tell, like go and look and see what that author did and learn from them, right? And I think you asked me a second question and I can't remember what it is.
I don't remember. I was thinking of like how often, and I don't think this was the second question, but how often do you get involved in an outline and maybe you start even writing the story, maybe you're even halfway through a story and you realize, yeah, I don't like where this is going. Would you go back and write a new outline? Or would you try to fix the story that's broken? Or how would you address that situation? I'm sure it's happened.
Yes, it's definitely happened to me. Less so now because of the way we vet outlines. Usually like now if I'm doing anything with an outline, not only have I examined it for story structure, usually someone else has looked at it too and given me an opinion on like how is this flowing? Is this going to work? Is there unbelievable stuff in there that's not set up? But okay, so there's multiple ways to handle it. And if you're a pantser, probably the way you handle it is you go back to the point where you were happy with the story and you try and figure out how to move forward from there. And probably you went off the rails at some point shortly after that. If you have a plot outline, one of the things that happens to me is that I always do a big picture plot outline and then I write the detailed plot outline. And somewhere in Act 3, I always see, it's very consistent. I see opportunities for the story that I didn't see when I made the big picture because I'm deeper in the characters' heads. And I'm like, oh, there's a much better ending to the story. And then I go back to the midpoint and I rework the outline from the midpoint because there's always a cooler opportunity that you don't see until you're in the characters' heads. And that can happen when you're in the draft too. Even if you have a really detailed story, like the things that you bring to the draft as you get deeper and deeper into the character and you realize, oh man, I didn't even realize that this relationship the protagonist was having with this minor secondary character really actually should be much stronger because it's really going to make their character arc work better. And then you're like, okay, so like I can deviate from my outline or I can stop and redo the outline. And how big the change is kind of depends. You might be able to just make some notes for yourself and write and just like keep those things in mind. But it's really normal. For me, it's really normal to happen in Act 3, whether I'm doing the outline or the draft. Usually because that's the point where the climax starts to become inevitable. And then you're like, oh man, this would be so much better if that had happened back.
Yeah, I would.
The point.
I might even take that a step further and say that beyond like normal, it's expected. So for me, if there aren't like changes as I'm going through, I'm going to ask myself, am I going deep enough? Like, am I asking big enough questions or am I just trying to fill in the template? Because usually if you are really going where the story wants you to go and paying attention to characters that went from a one sentence description to like they exist now, they actually have choices that make sense for who they are. And if that doesn't determine some story decisions, then you're probably a little too close to the surface. And if you're a little too close to the surface, you either have a book that doesn't really matter at the end, or a book that ticks all the boxes, but it doesn't leave somebody feeling, I have to share this, or I have to read the next thing this person does. Because, yeah, you filled out the template, gold star, right? But I think that we're all trying to create something that is a little more than that. And so the outlining, I'm not saying it should be painful, but it should not be breezy, because you are figuring out the story. If you have a really good outline, then you've figured out a lot of the story, and the actual drafting is more for like color, and you're filling in the blanks, but you're not making major story decisions. Your major story decisions, if you're really doing a full outline, your major story decisions should all be in the outline. And as Bonnie said, by the time you get to the end and you're really satisfied with that end, it's probably changed some things earlier along, and you want everything to agree.
I do find, though, that there are times, like Bonnie was saying with the character, while I'm writing it, after an outline is done, the character, something about the character opens up something to me, then I'm like, oh shit, I didn't think of that. That wouldn't go that way, and I have to change it. And yeah, you could do it earlier in the outline and spend more time in the outline and do that, and that's, the way I try and handle it. But there are times where there's things I just don't anticipate because I don't know the character well enough. Is there any way to get ahead of that? Maybe writing a really, really crappy first draft or something? I don't know, like or a shortened version of the book, like just a longer outline, something where you can avoid that, like. Because I personally don't feel like I fully know a character until I'm writing in their space.
I think it kind of depends on what kind of writer you are. Like, for example, I know Barbara Hambly, the way that she always does a discovery draft, or at least the last time I heard her talk at a conference, she'd say she does a discovery draft, she puts it in a drawer, completely ignores it, and then she goes back and starts the novel over and writes the real version. Oh. For me, that's like, I think I would be so demoralized if I had to do that. But also, like, my outlines, my outlines are usually like between 40 and 70 pages. So they're sort of halfway between what some people think is an outline and between the first draft, because I'll have like dialogue in the outline.
Yeah, Bonnie's outlines really are. Please take this exact story and convert it to prose. But the story is there. Like, all the decisions are figured out. Bonnie is a very thorough outliner. But on the spectrum, that's all the way over here. You can be a much thinner outliner and still have the story decisions made. So our outline that we developed together. Johnny? It's it's the 40 sentence outline is what Bonnie and I developed together, and that was basically 10 sentences. That was like, Bonnie made it great and fleshed out, but it originally started as, okay, I'm going to write a really fast outline. I know there's 4 acts. I just need 10 sentences for like this, what this chapter is about. This is what this chapter is about. So it's a little snowflake method-y in that it's just, I'm going to come up with these sentences, and then I'm going to flesh them out and make them all make sense together, and then have the connective tissue between them. So for me, I could write the 40 sentences and then create the connective tissue and then stick to that as the drafter. But as it evolved, Bonnie would put a lot of connective tissue in there to where there's really a whole story, and then I'm not figuring out a story, I'm writing a story. But it's like, as a creator, if you could think about the different parts and acknowledge what they are, it's different. You might have a story where you do a really, really thorough outline, and then the drafting is less taxing. Or you may have a lighter outline, and then the drafting is a lot more taxing. It doesn't all just happen, right? So you just have to think, where am I going to put my emotional energy while doing this?
So go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, like, also to get back to your question of like, what do you do if that happens to you? Like, I think part of the process is also figuring out exactly what you need to have in the outline to write, and maybe just accepting, I'm going to have to write the opening of the story, and then I'm going to rethink I'm going to rethink the last 3/4 of it before I write the last 3/4, because I know I'm going to know things about my character by the time we get to the first plot point that I didn't know, and I just don't know how to know that because that's not how my brain works. So I know people who are pantsers who actually outline in stages. They'll outline Act 1, and then they'll write Act 1, and then they'll be like, oh, cool, now I see Act 2, and then they'll outline that. You also, like, there are people like 90 who didn't used to use an outline at all. And she was basically making bullet points of like, I want these things to happen in the story, which is an outline, but she wasn't seeing it that way because it wasn't formal. And now she has a group of us who all brainstorm with her. And then she does make an outline, and it's about like a couple sentences to a paragraph for each chapter. And she doesn't want more than that because like her brain is really good at figuring out the scene as she's writing it and getting into the characters as she writes it. But she did discover that having a little bit more detail in terms of each of those chapters did make it easier for her to do that and to get into the characters faster. So like if you're struggling, if you write outlines and then you can never make the story match the outline, you might want to think about like, well, what could I do differently in the outline that would support what I'm doing in the story, and look at what you're getting stuck on in the story. Are you getting stuck because you don't have enough conflict? Are you getting stuck because your characters never want to do the things that they are supposed to do according to the outline? Are you getting stuck because you're getting bored with the story? Try to figure out what it is that's getting you stuck and go like, well, what in the outline would actually help me figure that out in the draft if I made this decision or these decisions before I started writing. And it's a little bit tricky. It took me a while to understand that I'm very backstory driven, and like I started having a lot less plotting problems when I actually wrote out my character's backstory in a couple of pages, because that was how I understood how they make decisions, was like what the trauma was that had shaped them. Whereas when I was focusing on it before and going like, ooh, well, I'm just going to focus on how much they hate the antagonist, or I'm going to focus on like how cool their power is and how they really want to learn it. And it's like my stories would just they just wouldn't work because that wasn't how I get into the character. And you might get into the character in a really different way. So understanding how you actually bond with the character, whether it's like interview questions or writing their journal entry before you start writing the story, or actually just writing Act 1 and being in the character's head. Like everybody is different, and you might have to experiment to find the way that you most efficiently get into the character's head.
Okay. I think that wraps up a lot of the basics. Is there anything that I didn't ask, or maybe some key thing that you feel a lot of people miss when they begin outlining that like would really change the game for them?
Oh man, that's a great question. I do think it's very personal, like based on what each person needs, because we all as writers, we read first, and we fall in love with stories before we want to start creating them. So we've all internalized different aspects of craft without realizing it. Just even by the time we get out of high school, we've seen so many stories. And
even if we leave high school early.
Even if you leave high school early. Yeah, so understanding, for me, it was really tricky, like figuring out what are the parts that I'm already doing well. And you can figure that out by getting feedback from other people. And then what are the parts that I really don't understand, and focusing your study of craft on the things that other people tell you you're not doing well. Rather, like when I started out, I tried to learn everything. And the things that I was still struggling with after my first year of writing were the same because like I was trying to absorb everything instead of really targeting the things that I didn't understand yet. And it takes a little while and practice to figure out what it is you don't know that you don't know.
We talked about this in the last episode as the difference between just-in-case learning and just-in-time learning. And I think this is a really good example of that. So if you are trying to learn to be a better writer, don't try to, okay, I'm going to learn dialogue, and I'm going to learn character motivation, and I'm going to learn scene description, and I'm going to learn emotional, like, don't. Do one thing at a time, and you will get better faster.
And that is really important, that one thing at a time. It's like, don't try to like say, oh, I have 10 problems, I'm going to fix them all. It's like, just go like, I'm going to get better at making sure that my character is always having emotional reactions where they're supposed to be in this novel. Or I'm always going to make sure that the character is always I'm going to get rid of every single line of on-the-nose dialogue in this novel, or I'm going to make sure that all of my descriptions are active instead of static in this novel. And just focus on developing that one skill, because often like fixing one thing that you're doing wrong doesn't just, even if it only affects like 5% of the words in the draft, it might actually make the draft 50% better, because it's one thing that is killing your story in every single scene of the novel. And you have time to like develop these skills. So like pick the one that you think is hurting you most and just focus on that. And then once you start to feel comfortable with it, then add the next skill. And you'll progress a lot faster that way than if you just try to learn everything at once.
Okay. I do want to thank you. And we are going to talk more in the next episode. That title is How Do I Make Great Characters? So we're going to talk a lot deeper on characters. And I think one of the things I didn't ask about in this, and we're kind of running out of time, is how to really nail your ending. And I think we can tie that into the character discussion, because characters, they matter to the ending. So
yeah, I agree that talking to characters that could totally be tied into the ending. And I'll end with, Bonnie, do you have a favorite story structure? Like I know that in the earlier notes I saw Dave had Dan Harmon's story circle, for example, is one that is very accessible. Do you have one that you would suggest? Maybe it's this two-part question. Your favorite, and then one that's just very accessible if someone just wants to grab it off the shelf and start playing right out of the box. This one comes batteries included.
I would go with, I think my favorite is 4-act structure, just because it's the most flexible, and it doesn't have like the specific journey built into it like Hero's Journey or Virgin's Promise or Save the Cat. Although Save the Cat is very, very flexible. But I mean, honestly, like whichever one gets the story done, right? It's like if I pull from multiples sometimes. It's like you can go through and if you're plotting if you see how they all line up, and there's charts on that show how you all line up, and we talk about that in Elevate Your Outline too. But if you can look and say, okay, I'm using 4-act structure, I'm stuck here. What happens at this point in the story in the hero's journey? Is this the point where a mentor comes in? Maybe I need to just include that mentor moment in my story, even though I'm not following the hero's journey. Or can I steal something from another structure? Do I need to steal that Save the Cat moment? Or do I need to think about the point between my inciting incident and my first plot point? Do I need to structure that as a debate the way they do in Save the Cat? It's like, don't be afraid to like mix and match, because they're all trying to do the same thing. As long as you understand why they're doing it in this particular structure, you can map it onto the structure that you're using and say, this is why this kind of a moment makes sense for my story here. But I think they're all good. I mean, it's just kind of, some of them are suited to more specific types of stories, and some of them are more flexible. And like Dan Harmon's Circle is really flexible, so that's a great one to start with, and it's really great for short stories. But I don't think there is like one that's better than the rest. It's just like, what do I need to get unstuck right now? And that's the one that's my favorite at any given moment.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate you taking the time to help us normally and help everybody out there. And if you want help with your writing, authorvelocity.com, we have tools in place, including the free course 10 Days to Flow. Is that the title of it?
It's 10 Days to Flow. Yeah, and we'll get the 40-sentence outline up there too. 40 sentences. Yeah, I was going to ask ahead of time and I forgot. So yes, all right. We'll also have something to help with your plots. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And that is authorvelocity.com. And we will see you next week with How Do I Make Great Characters. Until then, adios.
Thank you. Bye.
Shadows of the Sunshine State, redacted is his home. Lives a man named David Wright, who pens the great unknown. Diet Coke runs through his veins, a decoy wallet keeps him rich. Paranoia fuels his pen, and creativity's his niche. Write, publish, repeat.